Hi, everyone, and a warm welcome to the second seminar of our series, WombWor's Transcultural Echoes on Reproductive Justice. I would like to thank first the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing, hosted at ILCS, for allowing me to organize and for facilitating the series. And again, a huge thank you to Katie Collins for managing all the technological part of the series. As you probably read, this series features three seminars followed by a concluding roundtable discussion. And during our first seminar 2 weeks ago, we explored the theme of the right not to have a child. Today, we are addressing the right to have a child, an issue which is of particular relevance here in Italy, for example, where I'm currently based. Last month, nearly 2 years after Giorgia Meloni's far-right government took office, the Senate enacted the West's most restrictive law on international surrogacy. This law, fulfilling Meloni campaign, promised to make surrogacy a universal crime and penalizes couples who go abroad for surrogacy with up to 2 years in prison and fines of up to 1 million euros. And quite interestingly, Eugenia Roccella, who is Italy's Minister for Family, suggested that doctors should be required to report surrogacy violations. And in response, Filippo Anelli, president of the Italian Medical Association, declared, and I quote, "Our job is to heal, not to denounce." So this is just one example of the injustices experienced by those seeking to assert their right to have a child. And as our speakers will illustrate, this issue represents just one part of a broader spectrum of reproductive injustices globally, which makes me think also the fact that last week, before his re-election as US president, Donald Trump said he would be the protector of women, whether they like it or not. As a woman, I feel much safer now. And of course, I'm being sarcastic. So today's seminar will dive into the complexity of motherhood as represented in women's literature, examine narratives that, as I said, confront the right to have a child. First, we're going to hear from our speakers, and then we're going to open the space up for discussion. As usual, you can type the question in the chat or raise your virtual hand. I remind you that the three presentations will be recorded, but not the Q&A, so we can have a more free and open discussion. And the seminar will last around 90 minutes. So I'm leaving the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Laura Lazzari. If you want to start sharing the screen, Dr. Laura Lazzari holds an MA and a PhD in literature from the University of Lausanne, a Master of Studies in Women's Studies from the University of Oxford, and an MA in teaching from the University of Applied Sciences and Arts of Southern Switzerland. She is currently a scientific collaborator at the Sasso Corbaro Foundation for the Medical Humanities in Switzerland, and an affiliate faculty and scholar at Georgetown University. Laura has taught and conducted research for several universities in the United States, United Kingdom, and Switzerland. She specializes in motherhood studies and the medical humanities and has published extensively on women's writing, birth narratives, and trauma. She has recently co-edited 2 volumes by Palgrave on trauma and motherhood in contemporary literature and culture, and the Palgrave Handbook of Reproductive Justice and Literature. And her paper today is titled Childbirth and Reproductive Justice, Narratives of Trauma and Empowerment.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you so much for organizing this amazing series and for inviting me today. So obstetrical violence is recurrent in contemporary society, where it is estimated that 30% of women experience birth trauma, and 1 in 4 endure some forms of coercion during childbirth. Meanwhile, the choice to deliver a child in a birth center or at home, assisted by the midwife of one's choice, usually leads to a higher level of satisfaction, less interventions, and overall better outcomes for the mother and the newborn. One-to-one midwifery care is currently considered the best practice to assist women in the event of physiological pregnancies and childbirth. While giving birth at home or in a birth center are safe and legitimate solutions in low-risk pregnancies. Despite this, in the Western world, biases related to midwifery care and the choice to give birth outside a hospital are still widespread. Most women prefer to be assisted by an OBGYN, and hospital birth is the norm. People who consider different options are looked at with suspicion and held accountable if special circumstances arise. As usual, society informs literature, and vice versa, texts have the potential to bring social changes. Hence, in the last year, several books were written with the aim of processing, denouncing, and overcoming traumatic birth experiences. Although the act of writing is often chosen to address enduring experiences, stories also share positive occurrences, showing that when women are aware of their options and are treated with respect, different outcomes are possible. Some of these writings, based on autobiographical experiences, are more than just personal accounts of childbirth. They provide evidence-based information, denounce outdated and disrespectful practices, and address widespread paternalistic culture of violence and misinformation. These texts are meant to help readers to make informed decisions, to achieve a more positive birth experience, and challenge the current culture of birth. In my presentation today, I will discuss 5 contemporary cross-genre texts. Rebecca Dekker, Babies Are Not Pizzas, They Are Born, Not Delivered, published in the US in 2019. Give Birth Like a Feminist by Millie Hill, published in the UK in 2019. Isabella Pellizzari Villa's I Wanted to Give Birth in Holland, Story of an Announced C-Section, published in Switzerland in 2018. Memoir of a Singing Birth by Croatian author Elena Scocco, published in English in 2011 and in Italian in 2013. And What Unites Us, From Midwife Lucia to Our and Your Childbirth, written by Swiss-Italian writer Angela Notari in 2019. And the translations from Italian are mine. The corpus has been selected for some shared characteristics. The topic discussed, childbirth, and the hybrid genre used. At the same time, the authors provide an overview of childbirth experiences across different contexts, the US, the UK, Indonesia, and Switzerland, in 2 distinct languages, English and Italian. In the last years, authors have addressed birth experiences in innovative ways. Motherhood is no longer depicted as univocal, but it is interpreted as a subjective occurrence. Writers give voice to the protagonists of events that had hitherto been silenced. The purposes of these stories are multifaced. They denounce mistreatment, process trauma, provide information, disseminate evidence-based research, celebrate unconventional birth practices, and, if necessary, propel change in the culture of childbirth, as well as in medical care and hospital protocols. It is probably still premature to assert if birth narratives constitute a new literary genre, but it is evident that intimate maternal experiences meet the interest of a growing number of authors, becoming an established literary topic. Narratives of traumatic childbirth address similar topics and share common representations across languages and cultures. I will first compare texts written by Dekker, Hill, and Pellizzari Villa to highlight how trauma is represented in analogous ways. Birth trauma testimonies can be linked to accounts of sexual abuse and torture. In the last years, in the wake of Me Too and other social movements denouncing obstetric violence, women have finally started to reveal their stories of childbirth and abuse during childbirth. Dekker states, and I quote, "I was beginning to feel a little bit trapped, realizing that I was about to undergo labor without food, drink, movement, or permission to use the bathroom." End of quote. She retrospectively denounces forms of mistreatment endured in childbirth, and clearly shows signs of abuse. She had to endure frequent vaginal exams, was coerced to have a series of unrequired interventions. She was not offered comfort measures. She felt unsupported by her healthcare providers. And ultimately, her baby was taken away from her for several hours for no real medical reasons. Before delivering her twins, Isabella Pellizzari Villa goes through a similar experience. Her OBGYN strips her membranes without asking for her consent. Later, a midwife routinely breaks the first amniotic sac without informing her of the procedure. After these intrusive interventions, Isabella, like Rebecca, undergoes several uncomfortable vaginal exams. The language used to describe her dilation checks recalls sexual assault in the imagination of the reader. And I'm quoting by Isabella Pellizzari Villa, "Vaginal exams are more painful than contractions. They are invasive and I feel embarrassed. I'm sitting on the bed with the backrest semi-raised, legs apart and bent, with the heels resting on the thighs, the genitals exposed to facilitate the procedure. My sex offered to my gynecologist. There is no sheet that protects my privacy. The need for a sheet is felt only during the episiotomy to prevent the woman from being traumatized by the procedure. Thanks to this trick, some pregnant women discover that their vagina was incised only after the surgery. Vaginal exams are performed in turn by my gynecologist and the midwife. I stiffen every time they touch me." End of quote. Like in Decker's account, Pellizzari's daughters, despite being safe and sound, are taken away from her without explanations. She's not allowed to see them until the day after, adding trauma to an already trying experience. Birth trauma is defined as a birth event with actual or threatened serious injury or death, or when the person giving birth feels they have been stripped of their dignity or treated inhumanly. Birth trauma is estimated to occur in 33 to 45% of all births in the US and Australia. These numbers are astoundingly high, and according to Decker, explain why it's so common to hear horror stories about childbirth. Starting from the narration of their own singular experience, the authors refer to data and research, showing a pattern of abuse in childbirth. Similarly, Millie Hill refers to the relevance of trauma and PTSD as consequences of negative childbirth experiences. Despite different healthcare systems, the outcomes in the UK are very similar to the US and Australia. And I quote by Millie Hill, "Traumatic birth in the UK alone is estimated to affect nearly 1 in 3 women a year, with many of those between 4% and 18% going to develop PTSD." End of quote. Feelings of helplessness are key points in negative accounts of childbirth. The act of writing helps to regain control over an experience that was endured passively. Decker, Hill, and Pellizzari Villa's writing are also intended to bring change in society. Pellizzari's book was written to empower other women so they could reach a more fulfilling experience. A similar intent is present in Millie Hill's writing. In Give Birth Like a Feminist, Hill addresses the importance of women's empowerment in childbirth. She strongly believes that women need to, and I quote, "take charge, take control, and make conscious choices," end of quote. Drawing a clear comparison with the Me Too movement, and I quote again from Millie Hill, "We now need to turn the Me Too spotlight on the experience of childbirth," end of quote. In addition to this, the author advocates for a feminist sisterhood, hoping that her book will bring women together. Likewise, Decker wishes that her book will bring mothers together to change birth culture and empower women. Up to 700, the birth was considered a solely female domain. Before the establishment of the obstetricians on the birth scene, midwives assisted women in labor and delivered children in autonomy. From the 18th century, however, we assisted in a progressive medicalization of childbirth and a shift from home to the hospital setting. The profession of midwifery was increasingly institutionalized, controlled, and regulated. Therefore, midwives forcibly entered in a power relationship with male obstetricians and were subjected to their decisions and authority, even in the event of physiological pregnancies. Medical interventions, stir up and supine position imposed for the sake of doctors' comfort became customary, and healthy women were turned into patients even when pregnancies were low risk. Ultimately, giving birth in a hospital became usual since it was considered the safest, normal, and sometimes the only possible option. Predominant narrative has an impact on how childbirth is perceived. As Scocco notes, for many women in the Western world, and I quote, "the hospital birth is the only option, not only practically and legally, but also narratively." End of quote. In fact, according to the author, the dominant fabula depicted in movies, TV series, and reproduced in popular culture is always the same and emphasizes pain, panic, and the role of technology and women's passivity. Scocco also describes the anti-fabula. When childbirth happens outside of a hospital, death is inevitable. Either the mother or the baby tragically dies. Despite being stereotypically replayed over and over, Scocco argues that these are not the real stories. In recent years, childbirth activists have started to put respectful birth practices on their agendas, and the narrative is slowly changing. The power of storytelling is persuasive, and several initiatives were organized to denounce abuse through personal stories. Elena Scocco was the promoter of the campaign Stop Being Silent, Mothers Have a Voice, launched in Italy in 2016. Angela Notari, like Elena Scocco, believes that personal stories have the power to change the narrative and improve obstetrical care. This is the reason why in 2023, she designed an online questionnaire for women who gave birth in the canton of Ticino, Switzerland, meant to give voice to the protagonists and address aspects of maternal care that should be improved. Despite coming from different cultural contexts and giving birth in two distinct countries, Scocco and Notari present several similarities in terms of birth preferences and outcomes, writing styles, and advocacy. This makes it particularly interesting to compare their memoirs and their related activities in favor of more positive birth experiences. The decision to deliver their babies in a birth center, assisted by a midwife, was not impulsive, but the result of careful considerations. Angela Notari and her husband considered all possible options, gathered information, and prepared for childbirth in a proactive way. Delivering her baby in a birth center was everything but reckless, and Notari's decision was meant to ensure both their comfort and safety. Likewise, Scocco was actively engaged in the choice regarding her own birth. After watching the documentary The Business of Being Born, Scocco wonders whether she really wants to give birth in a hospital. Before exploring their alternatives, many women ignore that giving birth assisted by a midwife outside the hospital is a possible and safe option. The choice of the authors was influenced by the naturalness offered by a facility that shared several characteristics with their own home: coziness, calmness, and privacy. The continuing assistance and care performed by a trusted healthcare provider they already knew and who was skilled in supporting physiological birth constituted another point in favor. Disadvantages usually featured by hospitals are also mentioned. Strict protocols and guidelines, over-medicalization, non-necessary medical interventions, and widespread iatrogenic effects are usually mentioned by the writers. According to Scocco, and I quote, "Hospitals are unfriendly, ugly places. People are treated like patients, not like persons." And for her, the overall idea of having a baby in a medical institution was not a shiny one. Therefore, she wonders, why would I need to go to the hospital to give birth to my child if I was a healthy woman bearing a healthy baby? End of quote. Likewise, Angela Notari does not believe hospitals are the ideal places to give birth. And I quote, "I find it understandable that a hospital delivery room can be perceived as a foreign place, as it bears greater inhibitions than one's own home." End of quote. Another downside in some hospital systems is that it is not possible to know ahead of time which midwife is going to be on duty during birth. And consequently, I quote by Notari, "It can involve the change of several work shifts and therefore meeting several strangers in a time of maximum vulnerability." End of quote. In Scocco and Notari's stories, stereotypes related to childbirth are passed on by ordinary people, healthcare providers, and feminists. By sharing their own experience and positive experiences, the authors help change the narrative and contribute to create a community. Angela Notari writes her memoir in the spirit of sisterhood, to share her experience and support other women in their choices, whatever they are. Her intention is to inform about possible alternatives and break a taboo about an unconventional choice still stigmatized. In fact, she remembers how people expressed mistrust toward her decision, and she reports upsetting comments addressed to her. In addition to this, Notari is aware that the collaboration between doctors and midwives can be difficult, and biases are often passed on by doctors themselves. Despite empowering intents are clearly present in her memoir, Scocco condemns feminist movements that are responsible for passing on negative stereotypes in how childbirth is perceived, promoting medical interventions as the solution, de facto considering female bodies as defective. And I'm now reaching the conclusions. Medical interventions, disrespectful practices, non-empathic communication, and lack of informed consent are some of the motives that lead to negative birth outcomes. Whereas birth trauma used to be overlooked, more attention has recently been drawn to it, and texts published in the last years have revealed a pattern of violence in childbirth. Likewise, alternative positive birth stories have emerged, breaking the stereotypical dominant fabula. Scocco and Notari effectively managed to bring out a different narrative, where natural birth appears as a positive choice, and delivering a baby outside the hospital is a safe and legitimate option. The two writers are not only women who decided to deliver their babies in a birth center, but are also childbirth activists who promote initiatives that give voice to women. They both successfully managed to offer an authoritative counter-narrative, conveying their stories through innovative cross-genre texts. Hence, like Millie Hill, Rebecca Decker, and Isabella Pellizzari Villa, negative and positive birth stories are told through a new hybrid narrative form. Scocco and Notari's choice was possible because they experienced physiological pregnancies. Since women need to fulfill some conditions, out-of-hospital deliveries are not available to everyone. For this reason, a reflection on how to implement one-to-one care, providing a positive environment for all birthing people, remains necessary. On the other hand, it is important to note that these authors that I have discussed today are all educated, heterosexual, and in a stable relationship. Therefore, it would be urgent to adopt an intersectional approach to better understand how childbirth experiences are perceived, represented, and voiced by all birthing people. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lara, for our brilliant presentations. And I think obstetric violence, especially, is one of the topics that really needs to be discussed. Really need to have a conversation about it. So absolutely, thank you. We'll continue with our second speaker, Professor Sarah Fang, who is professor in the School of Foreign Languages at Wuhan Institute of Technology in China. Sarah holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Nottingham, and her main research areas include diasporic literature, comparative literature. Her main publications include the monograph Literary Fantasy in Chinese Diasporic Women's Literature, published by Lexington Books in 2020, and the chapters Haunted Modernization, Urban Legends and Cultural Transition in Contemporary China, published in 2024, and Reproductive Justice and Surrogacy in Chinese American Literature of the New Millennium, published in 2022. This paper is funded by the National Social Science Fund of China and is entitled Fantasizing Maternal Infanticide, Negotiation of Cultural Hybridity and Motherhood in Chinese American Literature.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this seminar. It's a great honor to present my paper today, and this is my title. I have to admit this topic is quite depression. While I write this paper, I feel quite down. Anyway, so how can I turn another page? It seems didn't work. Okay, let me use this way. Okay. So as Mary K. Mina notes, infanticide remains a profound taboo, seldom openly discussed. Even within feminist scholarship, literature, however, offers a unique platform to confront such taboo. While sociological and psychological studies often analyze the causes and context of infanticide, the literary metaphor of the murderous mother remains largely unexplored. Clinical psychologist Brooke Loffer observed that society often casts infanticide women as barbaric monsters or aliens, like any humanity or motivations. To understand the instance of infanticide, Loffer argues that it is essential for the infanticide women to be placed as speaking subject, not the other. Building on this, my aim is to bring forward the stories of those infanticide women to reveal how societal pressures contribute such extreme maternal actions. The metaphor of the womb and tomb, the nurturing yet destructive mother, challenges the binary perception of motherhood, instead presenting a morally complex space shaped by the systemic pressures. In other words, turning and herring stories of murderous mothers is an exploration of the murdered gray area between those concepts of white and black and symptomatic of social anxiety about women's roles and perceived abandonment of traditional femininity. So in my paper, I examined the narrative of two infanticide mothers in Chinese American literature, each from a different period. The first is a novella entitled The Wisdom of the New by Edith Eaton, included in her 1912 collection, Mrs. Spring, Fragrance, and Other Writings. Eaton was born in England in 1865 to an English father and a Chinese mother. And she experienced immigration between England, the United States, and Canada, which influenced the complexity of her cultural identity. The novella uses a third-person narrative to tell the story of a woman called Pang Ling, a Chinese immigrant mother who kills her son to protect him from American assimilation. And Eaton's writing is unique for its time as it contrasts with the yellow peril sentiments prevalent in American literature. She is not only regarded as the first Chinese-American novelist in English, but also the first to write from an insight viewpoint on Chinese people in North America. The second text is Amy Tom's novel, The Joy-Luck Club, published in 1989. Tang was born to a Chinese immigrant family in Oakland, California in 1952. Aside from its popular success as a printed book, the novel also was adapted into a feature film of the same name in 1993, directed by Wayne Wang. The novel consists of interlocking stories involving two generations, 4 Chinese immigrant mothers whose stories took place in China and daughters whose stories are being lived out in the United States. The novel devotes 2 chapters to each of the mothers and daughters, utilize multiple first-person narration to allow each character to tell her story. So one of the mothers, called Gu Yingying, and kills her son as a means of rejecting patriarchal dominance in her first marriage in China. Unlike Eaton's narration, which maintains narrative distance, this novel explores mother's interior life and illustrating the enduring psychological effect of her trauma in America. So these 2 texts were selected for the unique portrayal of Chinese American mothers who commit infanticide against the son, a significant deviation from more common portrayal involving daughters. In both cases, this action symbolized defense not only against the personal and feminine constraints, but also against the cultural structures that marginalized these women. Besides, the contrasting narrative style in these 2 texts allows a comparative exploration of how infanticide as a metaphor functions within different cultural, temporal, and narrative framework. So my paper argues that maternal infanticide in Chinese American literature functions as a metaphor for resistance, oppression, and confronting the complexities of motherhood. This act of infanticide disrupts the traditional archetype of motherly goodness, illuminating the pressure women face within patriarchal, racial, and cultural system, and it calls for a nuanced reading that incorporates the intersecting influences of gender, race, and cultural hybridity. So let's move to the first text analysis. And this novella uses the third-person narrative. It focuses on the male protagonist called Wu Sangui, a Chinese immigrant to the United States, and his wife Pang Ling, who joined him 7 years later. And this woman is portrayed as a passive, illiterate, and subordinate, adhering to Chinese custom, such as being silent in her husband's presence. Her silence, however, is not just a cultural trait, but a result of her constrained role within a patriarchal system that values her primarily as a wife and a mother. As Pang Ling becomes increasingly aware of her husband's emotional attachment to another woman called Ada Charlton, she grows jealous. And this jealousy is described not just as intense of sexual rivalry, but also a deep existential anxiety. The narrative suggests that Chinese women were devalued not only by the polygamy, but also by the association with the reproductive role. So her distress over her husband's affection for another woman reflects her belief that the mission of continuing the family line is unfulfilled. The narrator summarizes the Pauling's thoughts, quote, a woman of another race as being above the common use of women, that's jealousy of the mind more pregnant than animal jealousy. So her jealousy, cultural alienation, and difficulty adapting to American cultures culminate in tragedy act of infanticide. The act is linked to her growing anxiety over the cultural influences affected her son, particularly his education in American system. Her husband's decision to have the son spread card and teach him English present a break with traditional Chinese value and reinforce Pauling's sense of losing control over her son's cultural identity. In a desperate attempt to shield him from Americanization, she poisoned him before the first day at an American school. Eaton's narration of this infanticide is striking for its restraint. Rather than focus on the violent act itself, the same is filtered through Sangui's perspective. He hears Pauling saying to their son only to discover him dead, with traces of prison left behind. Pauling, in a trance-like calm, justifies her actions by invoking the idea that her son is spread from the wisdom of new. The child is happy. The butterfly moms not share the cocoon. The act of infanticide highlight Pauling's extremely opposition to the culture shift she preserves in America, considering the Americanization of her son as a direct threat to her heritage. The infanticide echoes the action of thieves in Toni Morrison's beloved published 1987, where Thais kills her infant daughter to prevent her from being returned to slavery. In both texts, infanticide becomes a paradoxical act of love and violence. The mothers, in the attempt to protect their children from an oppressive system, transcend the cultural code of patriarchal control, and the actions through violence reflect a desperate assertion of maternal agency in the face of dehumanization. As Mina suggests, these actions place the mothers beyond the traditional framework of male-dominant cultural codes, making them resistant to social comprehension. Eaton carefully depicts Pauling's transformation from virtuous traditional wife and mother to a figure capable of infanticide, illustrating that Americanization's process traumatic impact on Chinese immigrants. Rather than advocating for assimilations, Eaton highlights the need to retrieve cultural heritage as a survival mechanism in a hostile environment. Critic Amy Lin suggests that Eaton balanced the narrative by neither condemning Sanguis for insensitivity nor Pauling for her rigid adherence to tradition. Instead, Eaton highlights the tragedy of being between two worlds, while choosing one identity often demands the rejection of the other. The novella presents a complex tension between Eaton's critique and the reinforce of Orientalist stereotypes, while she occasionally confronts the mainstream portrayals, depicting Pauling as silent, passive Chinese wife who resist assimilation and engage in barbaric acts like infanticide. Eaton also offers a nuanced view of Chinese American immigrants. The third-person narrator convenes the male gaze and reveals Caucasians' attitudes towards Chinese women. At the end of the story, Sangui's brief note to Ada about returning to China with his wife after the loss of the son feels impossible. Elizabeth Emmons argues that this end reflects Eaton's romanticized, out-of-touch view of Chinese men, mirroring the condescending white women she criticizes in her stories. On the other hand, Eaton's narrative provides an immediate lens for observing Chinese American experience while establishing authoritative control over the story's interpretation. The method compels the predominantly European audience to engage with the other and force themselves from an alternative perspective. Critics have praised Eaton for his pathetic portrayal of Chinese American life, rare in the time of anti-Chinese sentiment, and for present characters with human emotions rather than stereotypical villainy or subservience. Eaton's exploration of the cultural clash between Chinese tradition and Americanization highlights the immigrants' struggle to adapt while confronting gendered and racial discrimination. This ultimately drives Pauline to commit infanticide out of desperation, deepen her alienation, and reinforce the perception of Chinese immigrants as barbaric. As McDonough points out, a civilization based on reason does not exclude barbarians, but also create them. So Eaton's work, while constrained by its time, marks an early articulation of a unique Chinese American sensibility that navigated the complexity between Eastern and Western cultural paradigms. As White Parks explains, Eaton's goal is not to emphasize sameness, but to give a voice to silent Chinese North Americans. Writing in an era of intense anti-Chinese sentiment, Eaton faced the challenges of resisting racism without abandoning her identity. According to White Parks, in this situation, non-European writers only had two choices: either assimilate into a European-based culture or resist the pervasive racism and discrimination. Eaton chose resistance, using dual fiction voice to balance market demand with personal and ideological themes. One voice conforms to popular formula for acceptance by European descended audience, while the other subvert stereotypes, allowing her to write against the grain while navigating mainstream expectations. In the decades after Eaton's work, Chinese American authors grappled with cultural alienation while defining positive identity. Early works such as Lin Yutang's My Country and My People, and along with others that are listed here, often portrayed Chinese American as perpetual outsiders, adhere to the other stereotype. As Alain Kim described this work as product of ambassadors of goodwill, promoting accommodation rather than challenging the misrepresentation of Chinese Americans. This discourse remains largely unchanged until 1970s, with authors like Max Hong, Kenston, Frank Tam, Amitam, among others, that Chinese American began to critique the simplistic notions of identity and hybridity. So let's have a close look at this time. So Amitam continues the tradition of representing Chinese immigrant women path first caved by Eaton, the landscape of Asian American representation began to shift dramatically in the 1960s and the 1970s, catalyzed by the civil rights movement, other related liberation effort, and immigrant reform in 1965, which all reduced restraints on Asian immigrants to the United States. This change began to challenge the stereotype of Asian Americans as unassimilable. And by the 1970s, Asian Americans were increasingly seen as a modern minority, a label often rooted in economical visibility and middle-class integration. While Eaton's approach to voice of Chinese American women was often cautious and indirect, Tom, in this novel, used diverse narrative voice to explore the complexity of self-expression. The novel explores the lives of Chinese American women through 4 mother-daughter relationship, each shaped by generational and cultural divides. Tang grants each character a distinct voice, shifting between mothers and daughters' perspective to create an intricate narrative tapestry. The Chinese mother wrestles with the history while adapted to new cultural contexts, and the American-born daughters engage with the legacies to carve out identity of the O. Through these narratives, Tom challenged readers to perceive a diversity of Chinese American voices rather than a monolithic experience. One of the most complex character, Yin, embodies the archetype of infanticide mother fraught with inner struggle and trauma. Her silence and repression profoundly impact her daughter, who mirrors her mother's feeling of being lost, unseen and not seen, unheard and not hearing, unknown by others. Raised in the U.S., Nina becomes haunted by a terrible vision of infanticide that reflect her mother's unspoken past. Ian's fearful story, such as a monstrous man in the basement who impregnates women and deworms their children, leave a lasting mark on Nina's imagination. As Nina grows, Ian imposes strict rules, offering terrifying warnings, unquote. A man can grab you off the street, sell you to someone else, make you have a baby, and then you will kill the baby. Even after they move into a new house, Nina's nightmares persist. She often has a vision of a mother murdering her daughter after neighbors argue. And despite Nina's confusion, Yin remains silent about her past. As Wendy Hu explained, in this novel, the mother's advice is shaped by her past traumas, yet lack context that might help the daughter understand. Nina's confusion is partially alleviated when Yin becomes pregnant. However, she quickly noticed her mother's alarming lack of caution, as if she's indifferent towards the life inside her. And Yin frankly bumped into the furniture, perhaps intentionally careless. When the baby is born with severe neurological damage, Nina finds her mother alone, murmuring in Chinese at the hospital that I quote here. The baby's eyes were open and his head, it was open too. I could see all the way back to where his thought was supposed to be, and there was nothing there. It looked right through me. I knew he would see everything inside me, how I had given no thought to killing my other son. Without understanding her mother's traumatic past, Lina concludes that her mother has lost her insanity. Her behavior becomes erratic, marked by muttering, lapse in memory and fitting weeping. And Lina recalls, quote, After the baby died, my mother fell apart, not all at once, but piece by piece, like plates falling off a shelf, but one by one. These maternal influences extended into Nina's marriage with her Caucasian husband, who explored her in both work and home life. During a visit, Yin becomes aware of the inequality of their relationship. She recognized that both she and her daughter had lost themselves. Her point question to Nina, then why didn't stop it, becomes a key moment, sparking Nina's journey towards self-empowerment and Yin's decision to finally share her own story. Yin's reflection reveal poignant desire to reclaim her voice, affirming all her life. I have watched her as though from another shore, and now I must tell her everything about my past. It is the only way to penetrate her skin and pull her to where she can saved. In the final section of the novel, Yin reflects on her life in China, narrating the experience that shaped her identity. Born in 1914 to a wealthy family in Wuxi, Jiangsu province, Yin enjoyed a carefree childhood, but her sheltered life ended at 16 with marriage to a philandering husband, treating her as a mere decorative vase for bearing children. He pursued other women openly, leaving her feeling trapped and powerless. In her vulnerability, Yin seeks a form of control. Upon becoming pregnant, she perceived the fetus as an extension of her husband and resolved to abort the child in an act of defense. This, as she explains, was not a bad thing to do in China back then, to kill a baby before it is born. Her overwhelming hatred for her husband eclipsed any guilt, and she said, because my body flowed with terrible revenge as the juice of this man's firstborn son poured from me. The film adaptation alters this narrative, portrays the son as born and cherished by the father as an emblem of masculine lineage. In the moment of the anguish, while bathing her son in despair and memories of her husband's cruelty, leads her to impulsively submerge the baby. By the time she regains awareness, he has drowned. This tragic act of infanticide, whether through abortion in the novel or drowned in the film, underscore Yin's profound psychological trauma and her desperate attempt to reclaim control over her life. Yin's psychological descent after the infanticide is haunting portrait of the guilt and sorrow. In a symbolic act, she covers all the mirrors, often associated with self-awareness, a powerful indication of her inability to face herself. She lived in the shadow of her trauma, lonely existing at her relative's home in the countryside, indifferent to all but her own suffering. Her life only takes a turn after learning of her husband's murder by a scorned lover, a release from his oppressive control that prompted her decision to marry another man, Clifford St. Clair, and seek a fresh start in America. Despite this effort, she remains haunted by her unresolved trauma, which perpetuate her marginalization and silence, even in her new life. Yin's decision to confess the infanticide to Nina 20 years after the event is an effort to reconcile with her past and empower Nina. Through telling her story, she seeks to reclaim her voice in her own history. This act of storytelling is a vital moment in the reconstructing of the relationship, as it allows both mother and daughter to confirm the respective struggle with identity. In contrast to Eaton's portrayal of infanticide, which marks the end of the Chinese women's immigrant life in America, Tang presented as a part of Yin's past in China that reverberate as a lasting trauma in her American life. Yin's confession is a moment of empowerment, as she said. I will use this sharp pen to penetrate my daughter's tough skin and cut her tiger spirit loose. I will win and give her my spirit, because this is the way a mother loves her daughter. Manina McAllister interpreted this act of reviewing the past not as a repression, but a promise, a way to reclaim identity and fulfill her role as a mother. Amy Tom's portrayal of the mother-daughter relationship emphasized the importance of storytelling in the empowerment of both generations. By connecting with their mother's histories, the daughter discovers path towards self-understanding, while the mothers reclaim their voices as well. As feminist scholar Evelyn Reed argues, a mother's victimization does not only degrade her, but also profoundly affect her daughter, who looks to the mother for guidance on what it means to be a woman. The generational conflicts and cultural clash depicted in the novel illuminate the value of heritage in the self-discovery process, emphasizing the transformative power of reconnecting with one's cultural roots. So, in conclusion, in examining two distinctive yet representative works, my paper highlights complex tension between tradition and modernity in shaping Chinese American identity. Both works use the motif of infanticide to explore the immigrant experience, with Eaton's narrative centers on post-immigration and Tang's pre-immigration. Infanticide in both texts functions paradoxically as both deeply unnatural act and a form of resistance, challenging patriarchal norms while reflect the cultural hybridity of Chinese American women. Through the metaphor of maternal infanticide, both authors explore the struggle of Chinese American women ensnared in the interconnecting oppressions of gender, race, and class imposed by both Chinese and American hegemonic systems. So this is part of my reference. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very meticulous, I'd say, presentation. But I think it's, again, crucial, to cast light on this taboo topic. And so also reclaiming the importance of maternal ambivalence when asserting the right to have a child. So thank you. We're moving to our third and final speaker for today, Dr. Holly So, who is the senior lecturer in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York. She holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and has previously worked at Paris Diderot University and the Sorbonne Nouvelle. She has research interests in modern and contemporary British and American literature in relation to gender, health, disability, and reproduction. And her paper today is The Ethics and Aesthetics of the Small, Interdependency in Contemporary Queer Motherhood Memoirs.
Thank you very much, Veronica. I'd just like to start by saying a big thank you to Veronica for inviting me to take part in this this seminar today, and also thank you to Laura and to Sarah for their really interesting talks. As you can see from my slide, the title of my talk today is The Ethics and Aesthetics of the Small, Interdependency in Contemporary Queer Motherhood Memoirs. And this is drawn from a larger project which looks at contemporary writing about pregnancy, birth and motherhood in British, Irish and American literature and life writing. So there's been a recent explosion of life writing, as is referenced in Laura's talk, of course, as well. But in particular, I'm interested in the recent explosion in life writing about queer motherhood in the UK and the United States. I've put some very recent examples of these on the slide, including Michelle T's Knocking Myself Up, a memoir of my infertility, and Kirsty Logan's The Unfamiliar, which were both published in 2023. Today, I'd like to focus on two other slightly earlier texts, which explore assisted forms of reproduction, pregnancy and birth, and the right to have a child through the lens of queer motherhood. And these are Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, published in 2015. And in particular, I'm going to focus today on Claire Lynch's Small on Motherhoods, which you'll see here on the slide, which was published in 2021. So Claire Lynch begins small, not with a conventional first-person I that we might expect of a memoir, but with a more ambiguous second-person mode of address. And you can see it up here on the slide. I've reproduced the first page just so you can get a sense of the form of the layout, which is quite unusual in this text. She writes, "You mustn't worry, they don't feel the cold, the little globes of hope, frozen in time like fossils in reverse, are becoming." And this first section, which is entitled Wonder, describes the conception of her twin daughters, and she imagines these beginnings. As you can see, the form of the text implicates the reader in the text's own process of becoming. We're asked to construct meaning from the small, scattered fragments of text across the page. Lynch describes the processes of assisted reproduction in terms that highlight different mediating technologies, and you can see this halfway down here. She describes the eye of the microscope or the camera in a silent movie. Language itself also mediates the processes, the physical processes that she describes. The sperm and the egg are transformed here into a clear glass full stop, injected with a comma. Through the short chunks of text, large spaces and singular words, Lynch invites close attention to the smallest of details, little globes of hope, two cells meeting. And she's very interested in this kind of attention and new ways of looking and closeness of reading. This emphasis on the small is central to the aesthetics, ethics, and politics of Lynch's book, and to my paper today. In her life writing, Lynch represents a process of assisted reproduction in highly material, microscopic detail. So this is another quotation from the text. She writes, "The most important work of the clinic can't be seen, not by the patients, not by the naked eye. Deep in the basement of the clinic, the embryologists do their fingertip work, skin hidden under latex gloves, eyes down, seeing the world in microscopic detail. Think of their their steady hands at work." Her book invites us to imagine a form of reproductive labour that remains invisible in highly physical, technological, and medical terms: hidden skin, microscopic cells, basement laboratories. And again, we're very aware of this being at one level of removal in terms of the kind of mediation, that this is something that she's imagining and kind of mediating to us through narrative and through text. Yet despite the tiny scale of this process, Lynch insists that, quote, "There's nothing small about it. This tiny ball of cells, the beginnings of a person who might be our next great love, or might be the baby who disrupts it all. The grain of sand that tips the balance, a break in the symmetry. The blurry dot that's made visible months later on the ultrasound scan represents, for Lynch and for her wife Bethan, a galaxy, a constellation of possibilities and different beginnings." Lynch's book therefore begins not with a single story of conception, but rather a sense of multiplicity. As we see in the penultimate line on the page, she celebrates so many beginnings in her life. The second half of the book's title, On Motherhoods, also celebrates this plurality, not only in relation to the multiple children that she has, but also in the model of maternity that it explores. Both Lynch and Nelson document the fine details of quotidian acts of care: feeding, folding laundry, playing, bathing, and fishing out, quote, "the tiny moon of their fingernail clippings that gather in the sink." These small scale acts are, Lynch insists, of great significance. She says, "There is poetry in all of these mundane intimacies." Both Lynch's Small and Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts assert, through the act of writing itself, their right to have a child outside of heteronormative relationships, as two women in the case of Lynch's work, and a queer woman in a relationship with a trans man in the case of Nelson. Many traditional motherhood memoirs end triumphantly with the birth of the child. But here, in these texts, pregnancy and birth are complex, messy beginnings rather than neat or triumphant endings. While these works are certainly about the right to have a child, they're perhaps even more fundamentally about the right to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. They make visible acts of queer family making, which, as Jennifer Cook argues, are often overlooked. In The Argonauts, Nelson critiques what she describes as queer theory's exclusive focus on radical sexuality at the expense of attention to queer family making. In these lyrical pieces of life writing, which often verge on poetry, and I think perhaps recall some of the kind of hybrid forms that Laura was talking about earlier, Lynch and Nelson experiment with genre and disrupt the linear temporalities that we might expect in a conventional account of pregnancy, birth, and childhood. Lynch returns again and again to questions of scale. For example, she condenses years into a few short double-spaced lines, which embody the significance of the small. And this is the quotation that I've got up here on the slide. Does it go without saying that I'm amazed by these small bodies? All the things they can do, that they exist at all. Why should you watch a body you once held in the palm of your hand, now riding a bike or running through a sprinkler, and pretend it is anything other than a miracle? Tiny cells replenishing, soft bones stretching out, the pace of it, forcing you to look more closely, small bodies growing before your eyes. So as you can see, she returns to the sense of wonder that was on the first page of the book, but she also suggests that this focus on the small encourages new ways of looking at and thinking about the world. This emphasis on the small and on the insistence of the value of documenting the fine details of a particular individual's experiences may at first glance seem to chime with the Anglo-American neoliberal political context from which Lynch and Nelson's works emerged. Catherine Rottenberg, in her book, which is up here on the slide, uses the vocabulary of the microscopic to describe what she calls neoliberalism's ongoing and relentless conversion of all aspects of our world into specks of capital, including human beings themselves, produces subjects who are individualized, entrepreneurial, and self-investing. They're also cast as responsible for their own self-care and well-being. Memoirs and life writing, which have become extremely popular since the turn of the millennium in both digital and print forms, could be seen as a distillation of this turn towards the privatized and individualized perspectives. For Rottenberg, autobiography is at the heart of a new type of neoliberal feminism. So, for example, Sheryl Sandberg's best-selling autobiographical polemic, Lean In, which is here on the slide, and Anne-Marie Slaughter's Why Women Still Can't Have It All. As well as these very high-profile examples, Rottenberg argues that many of the over 4 million so-called mommy blogs in the United States are part of a larger cultural transformation, which encouraged the commodification and depoliticization of motherhood. She also cites the example of the UK-based Mumsnet and Tracy Jensen's study, which concludes, while the articulation of personal experience could potentially produce an implicitly feminist public, these public articulations of private problems seem simply to confirm that parenting problems are the result of problematic individual choices. So I want to argue that Lynch and Nelson put forward a kind of writing about motherhood that's quite different from these neoliberal feminist autobiographical accounts. Their focus on the small, from the granular details of the text, quotidian acts of care, and the intricacies of assisted reproduction, is not about individualism, but is in fact a way into complex and layered explorations of motherhood in terms of interdependency. They explore forms of interdependency that are physical, technological, social, literary, and ecological. This interdependency is evident even in utero, Nelson suggests. She writes, we develop in response to a flow of projections and reflections ricocheting off us. Eventually, we call that snowball as self. And this snowball model of self, starting with the tiniest cell, speck, or flake, and then growing through its interactions with the surrounding environment, structures the associative form of both of these texts, which start small and then gradually incorporate different time frames, geographical locations, and other texts. In the Argonauts, the text itself reproduces the words and voices of an array of artists, literary theorists, and philosophers, and suggests that these are integral not only to Nelson's understanding of her own reproductive labour, but also her ability to engage with her wider cultural and political context. In her radio essay about the writing of Small, entitled The Other Mother, Lynch describes how her reading of a wealth of contemporary writing about motherhood, including Sheila Heti, Rachel Cusk, and Nelson herself, snowballed to become part of the memoir itself. Small incorporates a diverse range of references, from the epigraph from Virginia Woolf to Lynch's obsessive reading of what she calls an endless array of articles on the Japanese ceremony to mark and mourn the small lives of the miscarried, the aborted, the stillborn, which are called in Japanese the water babies. Lynch's own autobiographical writing is also bound up with a series of largely untold shadow stories. Her own fertility struggles mean that she becomes viscerally aware of what she calls the not yets and the not evers, the just in case eggs of the women who aren't ready, the last chance embryos of parents to be who waited too long. She describes this not only as a personal preoccupation, but also as a wider ethical imperative to imagine how your story is woven into those of others. You never stop thinking about them, she says. In the neonatal intensive care unit, she reads, quote, the letters pinned on the wall, pocket biographies of all the daughters and sons who lived out their whole lives on this ward, weeks or days or hours. When her father is offered a liver transplant, she recognises that his chance at life is predicated on the death of another. She writes, there is another story, but I don't know it. Another family, another call that came in the middle of the night. There was a person I don't know and can only imagine, a person with their own love stories and achievements, their own bad habits and unfinished business, a missing piece in a family. Perhaps the most striking example of this textual interdependency and the ways in which this enacts a move from the private to the public occurs when Lynch discusses her visit to Dublin at the height of the marriage equality referendum, which is the referendum on whether gay marriage should be legalised. The small details of the campaign posters, similar to the ones that are up here on the slide, are of immense importance to Lynch. She punctuates these descriptions with the binary yes-no message that they endorse. She describes pictures of soft-skinned toddlers and blue-eyed babies, actual poster children, no, and that's the vote no at the bottom. She needs her mother for life, not just for 9 months, no. Children deserve a mother and a father, no. Lynch rejects these simple binaries and suggests that these posters have many messages, including, in her reading, you're not equal and you're not fit to be a parent. Once again, she moves from her individual response to a more collective view, calling for readers to imagine the cumulative effects of living with these adverts every day, of passing them on the way to work or on the way to school. Lynch uses the memoir as a space in which to record affective responses, both her own and other people's, to the framing of these political campaigns in ways that are intensely personal. As Laura Briggs argues in the book which is up here on the slide, reproductive politics is at the heart of many of the most pressing political issues of our age, connecting welfare, immigration, abortion, schools, civil rights, social security, and gay marriage. So alongside this cultural and textual interdependency, Lynch and Nelson's writing intertwine different forms of physical and technological interdependency. Both texts culminate in striking scenes of physical transformation. In Nelson's The Argonauts, her partner, Harry Dodge's top surgery, parallels what Nelson calls the queer experience of her pregnancy. Their stories and bodies are both immersed in what she describes as an inscrutable hormonal soup. At the end, The Argonauts places Nelson's labour side by side with Dodge's visits to his dying mother, moving frequently back and forth between the two. Both accounts, which focus on small, visceral details of pain, care, and emotion, highlight a larger human condition of physical and ethical interdependency. Nelson quotes Judith Butler, who says, "We are for another, or by virtue of another." Small echoes this sense of bodies and subjectivities in perpetual states of transformation. Lynch draws a parallel between her father's liver transplant operation and the early arrival of her third daughter on the same night. While waiting for his operation, her father is described as having, quote, "an old man's body with a curved pregnant belly, smooth and hard." The yellow fluid that the medics drained from him, described in the book as a kind of liquid irony, parallels the gushing when Beth's waters break a few hours later. The baby, who's born by caesarean section, and her father, who's given a new lease of life following his surgery, ultimately have, quote, "something shared between them, something private, these two new lives." Like the sense of wonder with which Small began, Lynch describes how a series of seemingly small medical procedures have a momentous effect on their lives. Her father is saved by 60 years of small surgical discoveries, each improved method building upon the last, each new understanding a small change that makes the unimaginable possible. So I'm arguing that these small, seemingly personal details of particular lives do not represent a retreat into neoliberal forms of individualism. In fact, they offer a way into much larger ethical debates, collective forms of storytelling, and public political concerns. Lynch and Nelson's intertwined aesthetics and ethics of the small can be realigned with a recent move towards queer particularism, which is, I put some quotations here up on the slide, which are relevant to this. As Rebecca Sheldon writes, recent feminist and queer theorizations have turned emphatically away from the ambitions of late 20th century universalism in favor of particular forms of life. Lightning, atoms, jellyfish, and fetuses teem from the pages of prominent journals. This patchwork of objects and life forms has much to say about the ineradicable openness of the world and its disregard for the niceties of category and scale. They continue, "It is for this reason that J. Jack Halberstam finds that attending to individuals in their precarious specificities allows us to find our way through the thick material of the universal to the queer theoretical spaces of possibility." Lynch and Nelson explore precisely these precarious specificities. Their life writing offers spaces of possibility for thinking about interdependency as a shared human condition. The Argonauts and Small can be seen as part of what Jennifer Cook describes as the new audacity in contemporary women's life writing. By this, she means works in which life events, both quotidian and disruptive, propel reflection, a process that repeatedly tracks from individual, personal experiences to thinking through the collective and political implications. In some ways, the smallness of these texts, their cosy domesticity and white middle-class protagonists, can be seen to offer a view of queer family making that's reassuring to heteronormative audiences and distant from the radical, disruptive roots of queer theory. These texts are about the power of individuals and stories to be part of cumulative rather than radical or revolutionary change. As Nelson asks, as more queers have kids, will the presumed opposition between queerness and procreation simply wither away? Will you miss it? The small becomes a valuable means of accessing and participating in larger cultural conversations and forms of communal storytelling that acknowledge our shared condition of interdependency. As Lynch observes, motherhood is so often framed as a series of impossibly big questions. Should I? Can I? Is this the right time? The right person? But so much in life comes down to the small things. The smallest cells become the most important people. The briefest conversation can change everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, for another brilliant presentation. And I particularly like the fact that, of course, it is about queer mothers, but I think it also suggests the importance of queering motherhood more broadly. So wonderful, thank you.